The rain turned the Nebraska soil to thick, black mud that clung to everything it touched, and Sarah Brennan knew she should have waited for better weather. But the wheat needed planting, and she had already lost too much time burying her father 3 days prior. The spring of 1878 brought nothing but hardship to the Brennan homestead, situated 15 miles outside the small town of Red Willow. Sarah's hands burned where blisters had formed and broken, the wooden plow handles slick with a mixture of rain and blood. She was 22 years old, alone on 160 acres of stubborn prairie land, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The old mule, Chester, plodded forward with his head hung low, as miserable as she was in the relentless downpour. Her father had always said that spring planting waited for no one, and even though he was gone now, buried on the hill overlooking the creek, Sarah refused to let his land go fallow. Thunder rumbled across the gray sky, and Sarah wiped rain from her eyes with the back of her muddy forearm. Her dark hair hung in soaked ropes down her back, and her father's old coat, far too large for her frame, weighed heavy with water. She had been out here since dawn, had maybe finished a third of the field, and the day was already fading toward afternoon. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she gritted her teeth and kept pushing. If she did not get the wheat in the ground soon, there would be no harvest come fall, and without a harvest, she would lose everything. She did not hear him approach over the sound of rain and thunder. One moment she was alone with her suffering and determination, and the next there was a man walking beside her, his hands reaching for the plow handles. Sarah's first instinct was to pull away, to shout at the stranger, but something in his quiet manner stopped her. He was tall, with broad shoulders beneath a rain-slicked duster, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He did not look at her, did not speak, just gently eased the handles from her raw hands and took over the work as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah stood there in the pouring rain, stunned and uncertain. The man guided the plow with practiced ease, his strong arms managing what had been breaking her body all morning. She could see little of his face beneath the shadow of his hat, but she noticed the day's worth of stubble on his jaw, the straight line of his nose, the determined set of his mouth. He wore the clothes of a working man, a drifter perhaps, and at his hip hung a well-worn Colt revolver. Everything about him spoke of danger and hard living, yet his actions held only kindness. "Wait," Sarah finally called out, finding her voice. "You don't have to do this." He did not respond, did not even glance her way. He just kept walking, kept pushing the plow through the heavy soil with steady, methodical movements. Chester seemed to sense the change, picking up his pace slightly as if grateful for the stronger hand at the reins. Sarah hurried to catch up, her boots squelching in the mud. "I can pay you," she said, though that was a lie. She had maybe $20 to her name and supplies to buy before winter, or I can fix you a meal when we finish. Still nothing. The man worked in complete silence, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Sarah felt frustration mix with her confusion and exhaustion. She was not accustomed to accepting help from strangers, especially not without understanding their motivations. Out here, kindness often came with a price, and she had learned young to be wary. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour into 2, Sarah found herself falling into rhythm beside the stranger. She took up the seed bag her father had prepared before his heart gave out, broadcasting wheat across the freshly turned earth. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both to the bone, but the work went faster with 2. Where it had taken her all morning to do a third of the field, they finished another third in half the time. The stranger moved like a man born to farm work, his steps sure even in the treacherous mud. Sarah watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to understand who he was and why he had come. She noticed scars on his hands, old rope burns and cuts that spoke of a rough life. His boots were worn but well-maintained, his gun belt-oiled and cared for. This was not some saddled tramp looking for easy pickings. This was a man who knew hardship intimately and had decided, for whatever reason, to ease hers. As the afternoon wore on, the rain finally began to slacken, though the sky remained heavy and gray. Sarah's arms ached from casting seed, but it was nothing compared to the agony of handling the plow. She found herself grateful beyond words for the stranger's intervention, even if she did not understand it. When they reached the end of another row, she tried again. "At least tell me your name," she said. The man paused, straightening his back and rolling his shoulders. For the first time, he looked at her directly, and Sarah found herself staring into the most striking blue eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of deep water, intelligent and kind, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. He studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw far more than she wanted to reveal. Then, without speaking, he simply tipped his hat slightly and returned to the plow. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold rain. She was used to managing on her own, used to not needing anyone, and this silent stranger was unsettling her in ways she could not quite name. There was something powerful in his quietness, something that made her want to fill the silence even though she had spent the last 3 days barely speaking at all. They worked until the light began to fail, until the last of the seed was in the ground and the field lay finished before them. Sarah's relief was so profound she nearly wept. What had seemed impossible that morning now lay complete, her father's dream of a spring wheat crop still alive. She turned to thank the stranger properly, to insist he at least come to the house for hot coffee and whatever food she could offer, but he was already walking away. "Wait," Sarah called, her voice sharp with urgency. "Please, you have to let me do something. You just spent the whole day helping me, and I don't even know why." The man stopped but did not turn around. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, and for a moment Sarah thought he might finally speak. Instead, he just raised one hand in a brief gesture of farewell and continued walking, his tall form gradually disappearing into the gathering dusk and the last of the rain. Sarah stood alone in the muddy field, exhausted and confused and strangely disappointed. Chester nudged her shoulder with his nose, and she absently patted the mule's neck, her eyes still fixed on the place where the stranger had vanished. No one did something like that without expecting anything in return. No one worked themselves to exhaustion for someone they did not know without payment or even acknowledgement. It made no sense, and Sarah Brennan was a woman who needed things to make sense. She led Chester back to the small barn, rubbed the mule down, and gave him extra oats as a reward for his hard labor. The work helped settle her mind, gave her hands something to do while she tried to puzzle out the day's strange events. Her father had always said that the frontier attracted all sorts, that you could never really know a man's character until you saw how he acted when there was nothing in it for him. By that measure, the silent stranger was a better man than most. The house felt emptier than usual when Sarah finally trudged inside. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms with a loft, built by her father's hands over the course of 2 hard summers. Her mother's curtains still hung in the windows, faded now but carefully mended. The stove her parents had hauled all the way from Illinois sat cold and dark. Sarah built up the fire with stiff, aching fingers, put coffee on to boil, and tried not to think about the fact that she was truly alone now. She peeled off her wet clothes and dressed in dry ones, hanging the soaked garments near the stove to dry. Her hands needed tending, so she washed them carefully and wrapped them in clean cloth. Her father's medical kit still sat on the shelf, and Sarah felt the familiar pang of grief as she put it away. 3 days was not nearly enough time to accept that he was gone, that the big, booming voice and warm laugh were silenced forever. But there was no time for grief, not really. There was too much work, too much that needed doing. Sarah forced herself to eat some cold cornbread and beans, drank 2 cups of strong coffee, and tried to plan for tomorrow. The field was planted, which was a miracle, but there were still fences to mend, the garden to establish, 100 other tasks that her father had managed with ease and that now fell to her alone. She thought about the stranger as she sat at the rough wooden table. Tried to remember every detail of his appearance, every gesture and movement. The way he had taken the plow so gently from her hands. The quiet competence in his every action, those startling blue eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and strength. Sarah had grown up on the frontier, had learned young to be wary of strangers, but something about this man felt different. Safe, almost, though that seemed ridiculous given that he wore a gun and had appeared out of nowhere. Sleep came hard that night, her body too tired and her mind too active. The rain had finally stopped, and through the small window beside her bed, Sarah could see stars beginning to appear between breaking clouds. She thought about her father, about the promises she had made at his graveside to keep the land, to make something of the dream he had started. She thought about the impossible task ahead of her, a woman alone trying to work a farm built for a family. And she thought about blue eyes and strong hands and the strange gift of a silent stranger's help. Morning brought clear skies and the overwhelming smell of wet earth. Sarah was up before dawn, determined to make the most of the day. She had fences that needed mending on the north property line, where winter storms had knocked down several posts. It was hard work, requiring a post-hole digger and considerable strength, but she had learned by watching her father. She gathered her tools, loaded them into the small wagon, hitched up Chester, and set out across the still muddy land. The morning sun felt good on her face after yesterday's cold rain. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the creek running high and fast with runoff. Spring on the prairie could be harsh, but it could also be beautiful, and Sarah let herself enjoy the moment of peace before the hard work began. She was halfway to the damaged fence line when she saw him. The stranger sat on his horse at the top of a low rise, silhouetted against the brightening sky. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized his posture, the set of his shoulders beneath that worn duster. He was watching her, and for a moment, she felt an odd flutter in her chest, something between nervousness and anticipation. Sarah pulled Chester to a halt and stared back at the stranger. Part of her wanted to ride up there, to demand answers about who he was and why he kept appearing. Another part, the part that had learned caution through hard experience, warned her to be careful. A man who did not speak, who appeared and disappeared like a ghost, might be kind or might be dangerous. She had no way of knowing which. The decision was taken from her when the stranger nudged his horse forward, descending the rise at an easy walk. He rode a buckskin gelding, a solid-looking animal with good lines, and he sat his saddle with the relaxed grace of a man who spent most of his life on horseback. As he drew closer, Sarah could see his face more clearly in the morning light. He was perhaps 30 years old, give or take, with strong features and those remarkable blue eyes. A day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his dark hair needed cutting, but there was something undeniably handsome about him in a rough, weathered way. He reined in beside her wagon and touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture of greeting. Sarah waited, hoping this time he might speak, but he remained silent. Instead, he simply looked at the tools in her wagon, then at the fence line visible in the distance, and something that might have been understanding crossed his face. "I am mending fence today," Sarah said, feeling foolish for stating the obvious. The winter brought several posts down. The stranger nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that he had heard and understood. Then, to Sarah's amazement, he dismounted and tied his horse to the back of her wagon. Without asking permission or waiting for invitation, he climbed up onto the wagon seat beside her and looked at her expectantly. Sarah felt her frustration rising again. "You cannot just keep helping me without explanation," she said. "I don't even know who you are or what you want." He met her eyes steadily, and Sarah saw no threat there, no hidden agenda. Just a calm, patient presence that seemed completely at ease with silence. After a moment, he gestured toward the fence line, clearly indicating that they should get moving. "This is absurd," Sarah muttered, but she flicked the reins and got Chester moving again. "You are the strangest man I have ever met, and that is saying something out here." If the stranger took offense, he gave no sign. He simply sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough that he was not presuming anything inappropriate. Sarah found herself intensely aware of his presence, of the quiet strength he seemed to carry with him. It had been a long time since she had been around anyone other than her father, and the proximity of this silent man stirred something in her that she had thought long dormant. They reached the fence line, and the stranger immediately set to work. He assessed the damage with a practiced eye, then began pulling the broken posts from the muddy ground. Sarah worked beside him, holding posts steady while he tamped earth around them, handing him tools before he needed to ask. They fell into an easy rhythm, communication happening through gesture and shared understanding rather than words. The sun climbed higher, warming the air and drying the mud. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and felt sweat begin to trickle down her back. Beside her, the stranger worked tirelessly, his movements efficient and sure. She watched the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he swung the post hole digger, the concentration on his face as he aligned each post perfectly. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, a complete focus that Sarah found herself admiring. By midday, they had replaced 4 posts and restrung a good stretch of wire. Sarah's stomach was growling, and she had brought nothing for lunch. She was about to suggest they break for a while when the stranger walked back to his horse and retrieved a bundle from his saddlebag. He returned and offered it to her, and when she unwrapped the cloth, she found biscuits, hard cheese, and dried apples. "You came prepared," Sarah said softly, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." They sat in the shade of the wagon and ate in silence. Sarah kept stealing glances at her mysterious companion, trying to understand him. He ate slowly, his eyes on the distant horizon, always watching. She noticed the way his hand never strayed far from his gun, the alert set of his shoulders despite his relaxed posture. This was a man accustomed to danger, someone who had learned to always be ready. Yet with her, he was only gentle. "Why won't you talk to me?" Sarah finally asked, unable to contain the question any longer. "Did something happen to you? Can you not speak?" The stranger turned to look at her, and Sarah saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been sadness. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again and shook his head slowly. It was not that he could not speak, Sarah realized. It was that he chose not to, and there was a world of meaning in that choice. "All right," she said quietly. "I won't press you. But I want you to know that I am grateful for your help, more grateful than I can say." He nodded, and the look he gave her was warm enough to make her breath catch. Then he rose to his feet and offered her his hand to help her up. Sarah took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. For a moment they stood close together, hands clasped, and Sarah felt something pass between them, some wordless understanding that made her heart beat faster. They worked through the afternoon, finishing the fence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It was good work, satisfying in its physicality and its visible results. Sarah felt the ache in her muscles, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from accomplishment rather than futile struggle. With the stranger's help, tasks that would have taken her days were finished in hours. As they loaded the tools back into the wagon, Sarah made a decision. "Come back to the house with me," she said. "Let me make you a proper meal as thanks. It is the least I can do." The stranger hesitated, and Sarah could see him weighing the offer. For a moment she thought he would refuse, would simply mount his horse and disappear again. But then he nodded, just once, and something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. They rode back to the homestead together, his horse trailing behind the wagon. The evening air was cooling rapidly, and the sky was turning the deep gold of approaching sunset. Sarah felt a strange contentment settle over her, a sense of rightness that had been absent since her father's death. It was good not to be alone, even if her companion never said a word. At the house, Sarah directed the stranger to see to the animals while she went inside to start supper. She built up the fire in the stove, put coffee on to boil, and began pulling out ingredients for a proper meal. There was salt pork to fry, potatoes to boil, and canned beans to heat. She had flour for biscuits and even a bit of molasses for sweetening. It was not fancy, but it was substantial and hot, and she hoped it would be enough to show her gratitude. She heard him enter quietly, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Sarah turned and saw him standing just inside the door, hat in his hands, looking uncertain for the first time since she had met him. He seemed almost uncomfortable being inside her home, as if the walls made him nervous after so much open sky. "Sit," Sarah said, gesturing to the table. "You have more than earned a comfortable seat." He sat, but she noticed how he chose the chair that faced the door, how his eyes continually scanned the room. Old habits, she thought, born of a life that required constant vigilance. She poured him coffee and saw surprise and pleasure cross his face at the first sip. It was good coffee, better than she usually made, her father's favorite blend that she had been hoarding since his death. "I was not expecting company," Sarah said as she worked, needing to fill the silence even if he would not. "This place is not much, but it is home. My parents built it in 1869, just after they claimed the land. My mother died 5 years ago come summer, fever took her. Father and I have been managing alone since then, until—" She trailed off, the words catching in her throat. The stranger's eyes were on her, patient and understanding. He did not push, did not demand she continue. The simple acceptance in his gaze loosened something in Sarah's chest. "He died 3 days ago," she said quietly, keeping her hands busy with cooking so she would not have to look at him. "His heart just gave out while he was working in the barn. I found him that evening. I buried him the next day, up on the hill where my mother is, and then I started planting because that is what he would have wanted. The land does not wait for grief." She heard the scrape of his chair as he started to stand, but she shook her head quickly. "No, I am fine. I just need to keep working, keep moving forward. There is too much to do to fall apart now." The stranger sat back down, but Sarah could feel his concern like a physical presence. She finished cooking and brought the food to the table, sitting across from him. They ate together as the light faded outside, and the single lamp cast warm shadows around the small room. It was strange and comfortable all at once, sharing a meal with a man whose name she did not know, whose voice she had never heard, but who felt more present and real than anyone had in a very long time. After supper, the stranger helped her clean up, washing dishes while she dried and put them away. Their hands brushed as they worked, small accidental touches that sent little sparks through Sarah's awareness. She found herself watching him, noting the gentle way he handled her mother's old dishes, the careful attention he paid to the task. This was not a man accustomed to being cared for, she thought. This was someone who had spent a long time taking care of himself, alone and wary of the world. When the last dish was put away, the stranger reached for his hat, clearly preparing to leave. Sarah felt a pang of something that might have been loneliness, or maybe just reluctance to return to solitude after a day of companionship. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could think better of them. "There is always more work and I could use the help, I mean if you have nowhere else to be." He stood there, hat in hand, considering her question. Sarah held her breath, uncertain why his answer mattered so much. Then slowly he nodded and relief flooded through her. "Good," she said, trying to sound casual despite the warmth spreading through her chest. "I will have breakfast ready at dawn." He touched his hat brim in that now familiar gesture and slipped out into the night. Sarah stood in the doorway and watched him mount his horse and ride away toward the tree line near the creek. She wondered where he spent his nights, whether he camped rough or had some hidden place nearby. The mystery of him was deepening rather than clearing, but somehow that no longer bothered her as much as it had. The stranger returned at dawn, just as Sarah was taking biscuits from the oven. He cared for his horse, then joined her for breakfast, and they ate in companionable silence while the morning brightened around them. Afterward, they tackled the garden plot, turning over earth that had lain fallow through the winter, mixing in composted manure and preparing it for planting. Sarah had precious seeds saved from last year's harvest, and she handled them carefully, knowing they represented her only chance at vegetables for the coming year. The stranger worked with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, and Sarah found herself relaxing into a partnership with him. He seemed to understand instinctively what needed doing, and she no longer felt the need to explain or direct. They simply worked together, two people united in the common purpose of coaxing life from stubborn soil. Days passed in this fashion, falling into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The stranger appeared each morning at dawn and stayed until the work was done, then disappeared into the gathering dusk. They worked side by side, planting the garden, repairing the barn roof, clearing the irrigation ditch that ran from the creek. Sarah cooked meals for both of them, and they ate together in the small house, surrounded by silence that had somehow stopped being awkward and had become simply their way of being together. Sarah learned to read him through his gestures and expressions. A slight narrowing of his eyes meant he was concerned about something. A quirk of his mouth meant he was amused. The set of his shoulders told her when he was tired, though he never complained or slowed down. She began to anticipate his needs, having water ready when he would be thirsty, understanding which tool he would need next. It was an intimacy born of shared labor and quiet presence, and Sarah found it strangely fulfilling. On the 5th day, Sarah was working in the garden when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw 3 riders coming up the track from town. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. She recognized the lead rider as Cyrus Dalton, a rancher who owned land to the east and who had made offers to buy her father's property more than once. The 2 men with him were his hired hands, rough-looking men who always made Sarah nervous. The stranger materialized at her side so suddenly that Sarah jumped. She had not heard him approach, but there he was, standing slightly in front of her, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. The message in his posture was clear. He was placing himself between her and potential danger. Dalton reined in his horse and smiled down at them, but the expression did not reach his eyes. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, prosperous and used to getting his way. "Miss Brennan," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I heard about your father's passing." "Terrible loss, just terrible." "Thank you, Mr. Dalton," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her unease. "I happened to be riding by and thought I should stop to pay my respects," Dalton continued, "and to remind you of my standing offer for this property. A woman alone cannot possibly manage a farm like this. I would give you a fair price, enough to set yourself up comfortably in town." "The property is not for sale," Sarah said firmly. "My father built this place and I intend to keep it." Dalton's smile hardened. "Now, Miss Brennan, be reasonable. You cannot possibly work this land alone. It is too much for a woman. Sell to me now before you run yourself into debt and end up losing it anyway." I said no. Sarah felt the stranger shift slightly beside her, felt the tension coiling in his frame. For the first time, Dalton seemed to really notice the man standing with Sarah. His eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger's worn gun belt, the confident way he stood, the clear warning in his posture. "Who's this?" Dalton asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the stranger spoke first, his voice rough from disuse but steady and clear. "Someone who stays," he said simply. Sarah's head whipped around to stare at him, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. After days of silence, his voice was deeper than she had imagined, roughened by weather and time, but there was strength in it that matched everything else about him. Dalton's face darkened. "This is none of your concern, stranger. This is a private matter between me and Miss Brennan." "The lady said no," the stranger replied, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel. time you moved on. For a moment the tension was thick enough to cut. Dalton's hired hands shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their own weapons. The stranger did not move, did not even seem particularly concerned, but Sarah could feel the coiled readiness in him, like a spring wound tight and ready to release. Dalton must have felt it too, because after a long, dangerous moment he forced his smile back into place. Of course, of course. I did not mean to intrude, but Miss Brennan, the offer stands. When you find yourself in difficulty, and you will, remember that I am willing to help. He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed suit. They rode away at a trot, and Sarah let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The stranger watched until they were out of sight, then finally relaxed his stance. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. Then, unable to help herself, "You can speak. All this time you could speak." He turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something complex in his eyes, guilt and relief and perhaps a touch of fear. "Yes," he said simply. "Then why didn't you?" Sarah felt a surge of frustration mixed with confusion. "Why let me think you were mute?" The stranger looked away, his jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because words get you killed." Sarah felt her anger deflate in the face of those stark words. She reached out without thinking and touched his arm. "What happened to you?" He flinched at the contact, but he did not pull away. "Long story," he said. "Not a good one." "I would like to hear it," Sarah said gently. "If you are willing to tell me, but first I would like to know your name." He hesitated, and Sarah could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, he said, James Hartley." "James," Sarah repeated, testing the name. It fit him, solid and straightforward. "I am Sarah, but you probably already knew that." "Heard Dalton say it," James confirmed. He looked down at where her hand still rested on his arm, and something shifted in his expression. "Sarah." The way he said her name, careful and almost reverent, sent a shiver through her. Sarah pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture, but she did not step away. "Will you tell me your story, James?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah thought he might retreat back into silence. But then he began to speak, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as if now that the dam was broken, the flood could not be stopped. "I was a scout for the army," he said. "Down in Texas, along the border. Spent 3 years tracking raiders and outlaws, learning to read the land and move quiet. Got good at it, too good maybe. When my enlistment was up, I hired on with a cattle outfit, helped drive herds north to the railheads in Kansas." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. 2 years ago, I was working a drive out of San Antonio. We got hit by rustlers 3 days north of the Red River. They killed the trail boss and 2 other drovers in the first volley. I managed to get to cover and take down 3 of them before the rest scattered. Sarah listened intently, barely breathing, afraid that if she interrupted, he would stop talking. "The outfit owner blamed me," James continued, his voice tight with old anger. "Said I must have been in on it, that the timing was too convenient. He spread word all through the cattle towns that I was a thief and a killer. Put a price on my head, not official-like, but enough that bounty hunters and men looking to make a name started coming after me." "That is terrible," Sarah breathed. "Surely you could have explained, found someone to believe you." James shook his head. "Tried, but the owner was rich and connected, and I was just a hired hand. No one wanted to listen, so I ran. Spent the last 2 years moving from place to place, never staying long, never giving anyone a chance to know me. Never talking unless I had to, because every word is a chance for someone to recognize you, to remember you, to point you out when the wrong person comes asking." He finally looked at her directly, and Sarah saw the weight of exhaustion and loneliness in his eyes. "I came through Red Willow 3 weeks back, thought I might just keep moving. But then I saw you, out in that field in the rain, working yourself to death trying to do the impossible, and I could not just ride past. My mother worked herself into an early grave on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri. Watching you reminded me of her, and I thought maybe I could help. Just for a day, then I would move on. But you stayed," Sarah said softly. "But I stayed, James agreed. Kept telling myself I would leave the next day, but then there would be more work, and you needed help, and I have not had a place to be or a purpose in so long that I could not bring myself to walk away. Sarah felt her heart aching for him, for the injustice he had suffered and the lonely, hunted life he had been forced to live. Those men who accused you, they were wrong, I can see that. You are a good man, James Hartley. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You do not know me well enough to say that. I know you well enough, Sarah insisted. I have seen how you work, how you move through the world. I have watched you be nothing but kind and helpful, asking nothing in return. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. James shook his head, but Sarah could see that her words had affected him. What if someone comes looking? What if I bring trouble down on you? Then we will face it together, Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. But right now, today, you are safe here. You are welcome here. And if you want to stay, I would be glad of it. The hope that flickered across his face was painful to witness. You mean that? I do, Sarah said firmly. I need help with this farm, and you seem to need a place to be. That sounds like a fair arrangement to me. They stood there in the garden, surrounded by freshly turned earth and the promise of growing things, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift between them. What had been a strange, silent partnership was becoming something deeper, something that scared her a little but also filled her with a warmth she had not felt in years. All right, James said finally. I will stay, for now. Good, Sarah said, and found herself smiling despite the seriousness of everything he had told her. Then let us finish this garden before the day gets away from us. They worked together through the afternoon, but everything was different now. James spoke occasionally, pointing out something that needed attention or asking a question about how she wanted things done. His voice was becoming less rusty with use, settling into a pleasant baritone that Sarah found herself listening for. The silence between them was no longer the silence of a mute man and a wary woman, but the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. That evening, as they sat at supper, Sarah asked, "Where have you been sleeping? You disappear every night." James looked slightly embarrassed. There is an old line shack about 2 miles from here, near that stand of cottonwoods by the creek. It is half fallen down, but the roof still keeps most of the rain out. I have been camping there. Sarah frowned. That old place is barely standing. You should stay here in the barn at least. There is a small room in the back where my father used to keep tack. It has a cot and a stove. I do not want to presume, James said carefully. You are not presuming. You are accepting a practical arrangement, Sarah countered. It makes no sense for you to ride out every night when there is perfectly good shelter right here. James considered this, then nodded slowly. If you are sure, I am sure, Sarah said firmly. So James moved his few belongings into the tack room, and Sarah found herself oddly comforted by his presence nearby. At night, she could see the glow of his lamp through the barn window, and it eased something in her chest to know she was not entirely alone on the homestead. The days fell into a new rhythm. They worked together from dawn until dusk, and Sarah marveled at how much could be accomplished with 2 pairs of hands. The garden flourished under their care, neat rows of potatoes and beans, carrots and squash pushing up through the dark soil. The wheat field showed the first tender green shoots of new growth. Fences were mended, the barn roof patched, the irrigation ditch cleared and flowing smoothly. The homestead was beginning to look cared for again, no longer the struggling operation of a grieving woman alone, but a real working farm. As they worked, they talked. James told her stories of his time in Texas, of the vast open spaces and the hard men who lived there. He spoke of his childhood in Missouri, of a father who died young and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep the farm going. He described the cattle drives, the thunder of hooves and the endless dust, the satisfaction of bringing a herd safely to market. Sarah, in turn, shared her own stories. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about the hard first years when there was never quite enough of anything. She spoke of her mother's gentle strength and her father's stubborn determination. She described the joy of watching the land slowly transform from raw prairie to productive farm, the pride her parents had taken in building something lasting. And as they talked and worked together, Sarah felt something growing between them, tender and new like the plants in her garden. She found herself watching James when she thought he was not looking, admiring the strong lines of his face, the capable movements of his hands. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which he was doing more and more often. She felt her heart skip when their hands touched accidentally, felt warmth spread through her chest when he looked at her with those deep blue eyes. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural result of having someone to share the burden with after so long alone. But deep down, Sarah knew it was more than that. She was falling in love with James Hartley, this wounded, quiet man who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. A month after James first appeared in her rain-soaked field, Sarah was washing clothes by the pump when she heard the sound of many horses approaching. Her stomach clenched with worry, and she turned to see a group of riders coming up the track. James was out checking the fence line, and for a moment, Sarah felt very alone and vulnerable. But as the riders drew closer, Sarah saw that the man in the lead wore a silver star on his vest. The marshal from Red Willow, a tall, weathered man named Tom Carson, reined in his horse and touched his hat respectfully. "Morning, Miss Brennan," Marshal Carson said. "Sorry to intrude, but I need to ask you some questions." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have had reports of a wanted man in the area," Carson said. "A man named James Hartley, wanted for rustling and murder down in Texas. Some folks say they have seen him around here." Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. "What makes you think he is here?" "Cyrus Dalton mentioned seeing a stranger with you a few weeks back," Carson said, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Said he had the look of a gun hand. Now, I know Dalton has his own reasons for wanting you gone from this land, but I cannot ignore a report like that. So I will ask you straight, is there a man named James Hartley staying on your property?" Sarah met the marshal's eyes directly and made a decision that she knew might change everything. "Yes," she said. "He is here, and he is not guilty of anything except trying to live his life in peace." Carson's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I am going to need to talk to him. Where is he?" "Checking the north fence line," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Marshal, please listen to me. James is a good man. He was falsely accused. He has been helping me work this farm, and he has been nothing but kind and honorable." "That may be," Carson said, not unkindly, "but there is a price on his head, and I have a job to do. Now you can either take me to him or I can search the property. Your choice." Before Sarah could respond, James's voice came from behind them. "No need for searching, Marshal. I am right here." Sarah spun around to see James walking toward them, his hands held out from his sides to show he was not going for his gun. His face was calm, but Sarah could see the resignation in his eyes, and it broke her heart. "No," Sarah said sharply, moving to stand beside James. "Marshal Carson, you cannot arrest him. He has done nothing wrong." "Step aside, Miss Brennan," Carson said, though his voice was gentle. "Hartley, I am going to need you to unbuckle that gun belt nice and slow." James complied, lowering the belt carefully to the ground. "Marshal, I did not rustle those cattle. I tried to stop the men who did, and I was blamed for it afterward. I have been running ever since." "So I have heard," Carson said. "And I have also heard that you are pretty handy with that gun. Killed 3 men in that raid is what they say." 3 men who were killing my friends and stealing cattle," James said steadily. "I defended myself and the herd, that is all." "That is for a court to decide," Carson said. He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward to take James into custody. "Wait," Sarah cried out, desperation making her voice shake. "Please, Marshal, there must be something that can be done. An investigation, a trial, something to prove his innocence." Carson looked at her, and Sarah saw something like sympathy in his eyes. "Miss Brennan, I understand that Hartley has been helpful to you, but the law is the law. There is a warrant out for his arrest, and I have to honor it. He will get his chance to tell his side of the story, but that needs to happen in front of a judge. James caught Sarah's eye and shook his head slightly, a clear message for her not to fight this. "It is all right, Sarah," he said quietly. "I knew this day would come eventually. I am just sorry I brought it to your door." "Don't," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Don't apologize for helping me. Don't apologize for being a good man." The deputies led James toward one of the horses, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She watched helplessly as they bound his hands as they prepared to take him away, and fury rose up in her to join the grief. "Marshal Carson," she said, her voice steadying with determination. "I am coming with you. If James has to face a judge, then I am going to be there to testify on his behalf." Carson looked surprised. "Miss Brennan, that is not necessary. You have a farm to run." "The farm will keep for a few days," Sarah said firmly. "James Hartley is a good man who has been unjustly accused, and I will not let him face this alone." James started to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a look. "Do not even try to talk me out of this," she said. "You stood by me when I needed help. Now I am standing by you." Carson sighed but nodded. "All right if you insist, but we leave within the hour." Sarah quickly gathered what she needed, changing into her best dress, packing a small bag with essentials. Her mind was racing, trying to think of how she could help James, what she could possibly do to prove his innocence. She had no legal knowledge, no connections or influence. All she had was the absolute certainty that James was a good man, and the desperate hope that truth would somehow prevail. They rode to Red Willow, James on a borrowed horse with his hands bound, Sarah beside him on Chester. The journey took several hours, and Sarah used the time to question James about the details of what had happened 2 years ago. She needed to understand everything if she was going to help him. "The outfit owner's name was Silas Grant," James told her, his voice low so only she could hear. "He runs one of the biggest cattle operations in Texas. He has money and power, and when his cattle were stolen, he needed someone to blame." "But why you?" Sarah asked. "Why were you singled out?" James was quiet for a moment. "I had a reputation for being good with a gun. Some of the other drovers were scared of me, I think. When things went bad, it was easier to believe I was in on it than to accept that rustlers had outsmarted us." "What about the other drovers who survived?" Sarah pressed. "Surely some of them would speak for you." "There were only 2 others, and they both backed Grant's story," James said bitterly. "Maybe they believed it, or maybe Grant paid them. I never found out. By the time I realized how bad things were, there was a price on my head and I was running for my life." In Red Willow, James was locked in the small jail, and Sarah took a room at the boarding house. She spent the evening writing letters, reaching out to everyone she could think of who might be able to help. She wrote to the territorial governor, to the army post where James had served, to anyone who might have influence or information. It was probably futile, but she had to try. The next morning, Sarah went to the jail to see James. Marshal Carson allowed her a brief visit, and she found James sitting on the narrow cot in his cell, looking tired but composed. "You should go home," James said as soon as he saw her. "There is nothing you can do here, and your farm needs tending." "I am not leaving," Sarah said firmly, pulling up a chair near the cell bars. "We are going to fight this, James. We are going to find a way to prove your innocence." "Sarah, you are a dreamer," James said, but there was warmth in his voice. "Grant has money and power. I have nothing but my word, and the word of a drifter counts for precious little." "Then we will find evidence," Sarah insisted. "There must be someone who knows the truth, someone who can testify on your behalf." James smiled sadly. "I appreciate your faith in me, more than you know. But I have accepted that this is how my story ends. I just hope I do not hang, a prison sentence I can survive." "Don't talk like that," Sarah said fiercely. "I am not giving up on you, so you had better not give up on yourself." She spent the next week in Red Willow, visiting James every day, continuing to write letters and make inquiries. The town buzzed with gossip about the wanted man and the woman who stood by him. Some folks thought Sarah was foolish, Others admired her loyalty. She did not care what they thought. All that mattered was James. Then, 10 days after James's arrest, something remarkable happened. Sarah was at the boarding house when Marshal Carson came looking for her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Brennan," he said, "you need to come to my office. There is someone here you need to meet." Sarah followed him quickly, her heart pounding with hope and fear. In the marshal's office, she found a grizzled man in his 60s, weather-beaten and tough-looking, with the bearing of someone who had spent his life on the frontier. "Miss Brennan, this is Wade Tucker," Carson said. He was the trail boss on the cattle drive where James Hartley was accused of rustling. Sarah felt her knees go weak. "You were killed," she said, remembering what James had told her. "They said you died in the first attack." Tucker's face split in a grim smile. "They thought I was dead." "Hell, I thought I was dead for a while there. Took a bullet to the chest and went down hard. The rustlers left me for dead, and by the time I came around, the rest of the outfit was gone. Took me months to recover, and by the time I was on my feet again, the drive was long over." "Do you know what happened?" Sarah asked urgently. "Can you testify about what really occurred?" "I can," Tucker said firmly. "I saw the whole thing. Those rustlers hit us at dawn, caught us by surprise. They killed 2 men in the first volley, shot me, and were making off with the herd. James Hartley took cover and fought back. He took down 3 of them and scattered the rest, saved most of the herd. He is a hero, not a criminal." Sarah felt tears of relief flooding her eyes. "Why did Silas Grant lie about him?" Tucker's expression darkened. "Because Grant's son was one of the rustlers. I recognized the boy, recognized his horse. Grant could not accept that his own son would steal from him, so he made up a story that put the blame elsewhere. I have been trying to find Hartley for months to set the record straight, but he disappeared. When I heard about his arrest, I came as fast as I could. Marshal Carson was already moving. I will send word to the territorial office. With Tucker's testimony, the charges against Hartley should be dropped immediately." Sarah could barely breathe. "Can I see him? Can I tell him?" "Better than that," Carson said with the first real smile she had seen from him. "I can let him go right now. Tucker's testimony is good enough for me." They walked to the jail together, and Sarah watched with overwhelming relief as Marshal Carson unlocked James's cell. James stood slowly, confusion written all over his face. "What is happening?" he asked. "You are free," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "James, this is Wade Tucker. He survived the raid. He is here to testify that you are innocent." James stared at Tucker as if seeing a ghost. "Wade. But you were dead. I saw you fall." "Takes more than a bullet to kill an old bull like me," Tucker said gruffly. He extended his hand and James shook it, dazed. "I am sorry it took so long to find you, boy, but I am here now and I will make sure the world knows what really happened." James turned to Sarah and the expression on his face made her heart clench. "You did this," he said wonderingly. "You would not give up." "I told you I would not let you face this alone," Sarah said, moving closer to him. James reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. Sarah felt the tremor running through him, the release of 2 years of fear and running and loneliness. She held him just as tightly, feeling the solid reality of him, warm and alive and free. "Thank you," James whispered against her hair. "Thank you for believing in me." They stayed in Red Willow another week, while the legal matters were sorted out. Wade Tucker gave a full statement to Marshal Carson, and the warrant for James's arrest was officially withdrawn. Tucker even wrote a letter to Silas Grant, informing him that his son had been one of the rustlers and that James Hartley had been falsely accused. Whether Grant would face any consequences for his lies was uncertain, but at least the truth was now known. During that week, James and Sarah grew even closer. Freed from the shadow of arrest and execution, James seemed lighter, more open. They walked through Red Willow together, ignoring the curious stares and whispered gossip. They talked long into the evenings about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams for the future. One night, sitting on the boarding house porch and watching the stars come out, James took Sarah's hand in his. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. These past months working beside you, getting to know you, have been the best of my life. You gave me a place to belong when I had been running for so long. You fought for me when I had given up on myself. Sarah, I am in love with you." Sarah felt joy surge through her, so intense it almost hurt. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you took the plow from my hands without asking for anything in return." James smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his face. "I am just a drifter with nothing to offer but a strong back and a willingness to work. But if you will have me, I would like to spend the rest of my life helping you work that farm, building something good with you." "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Yes, I will have you. I want nothing more than to build a life with you." James leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sweet, a promise of all the tomorrows they would share. Sarah kissed him back, feeling like she had finally found the missing piece of herself, the partner she had not even known she was looking for. They were married 3 days later, a simple ceremony in the small church in Red Willow. Wade Tucker stood as witness, along with Marshall Carson and a few of the townspeople who had come to believe in James's innocence. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and James wore new clothes bought with some of the money Tucker had given him as back wages from the cattle drive. As they stood together before the minister, speaking their vows, Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was how things were meant to be. Two people who had both known loss and hardship, finding each other and choosing to build something good together. They returned to the homestead as husband and wife, and Sarah felt like she was seeing the place with new eyes. It was no longer just her father's dream or her burden. It was their home, the foundation of the life they would build together. The years that followed were not always easy. Farming never was. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when the crops failed and money was tight. But with James beside her, Sarah weathered every storm. They worked the land together, expanding the farm slowly but steadily. James proved to be not just a capable farmhand but an excellent businessman, making smart decisions about what to plant and when to sell. 3 years after their marriage, Sarah gave birth to a son they named Daniel after her father. 2 years later came a daughter, Emma, named for James's mother. The children grew up strong and healthy, learning from an early age to love the land and respect the work it required. James never completely lost his wariness, that habit of watching horizons and checking over his shoulder. But as the years passed and no trouble came, he began to relax into the peaceful life they had built. He laughed more easily, smiled more often. The shadows that had lived in his eyes when Sarah first met him gradually faded, replaced by contentment and joy. They became fixtures in the community, respected for their hard work and integrity. James helped neighbors with difficult tasks, taught young men the skills he had learned as a scout and drover. Sarah became known for her generosity, always willing to share food or knowledge or simply a listening ear. On their 10th anniversary, James and Sarah stood together on the hill where her parents were buried, looking out over the farm that had grown from 160 acres to nearly 400. The house had been expanded, the barn rebuilt, fields of wheat and corn stretching to the horizon. In the distance, they could see their children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. "Your father would be proud," James said, slipping his arm around Sarah's waist. "You kept his dream alive." "We kept it alive," Sarah corrected, leaning into his warmth. "I could not have done any of this without you. You would have found a way," James said with certainty. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." Sarah smiled and looked up at her husband, at the man who had appeared out of nowhere on a rainy day and changed her life forever. "Do you remember that day?" she asked. "When you first came and helped me plow the field, every detail," James said softly. "I remember thinking you were the most determined, stubborn, beautiful woman I had ever seen. I remember wanting to help you so badly it hurt. I told myself it was just for a day, but I think I knew even then that I was going to stay." "I am glad you stayed," Sarah said simply. I am glad you chose this life." "It was the easiest choice I ever made," James replied. He kissed her forehead, gentle and loving. "You saved me, Sarah. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to believe that good things were still possible. I will spend the rest of my life grateful for that rainy day when I saw you in that field." They stood together on the hill as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Below them, the farm stretched out like a promise kept, the land they had worked and loved and built their lives upon. In the distance, their children were calling them home to supper, their voices bright with happiness. James and Sarah walked down the hill hand in hand, returning to the life they had created together. It had started with silence and rain and a stranger's unexpected kindness. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. A love story written in turned soil and planted seeds, in hard work and unwavering faith, in two damaged souls finding healing in each other's presence. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. Daniel grew tall and strong like his father, learning to handle horses and work the land with quiet competence. Emma inherited her mother's determination and her father's watchful eyes, growing into a young woman who could outwork most men and still find time to read every book she could get her hands on. When Daniel was 15 and Emma 13, a drought struck the region, the worst anyone could remember. The wheat withered in the fields and the creek ran low. Other families packed up and left, unable to sustain themselves through the hard times. But James and Sarah held on, drawing water from the well, rationing supplies, refusing to give up on the land they had fought so hard to keep. One evening during that terrible summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over fields of dying crops, Emma asked, "Papa, how did you and Mama meet?" James and Sarah exchanged a smile. It was a story they had told their children before, but it never got old in the telling. "Your mother was plowing a field in the rain," James began, his voice warm with memory. "All alone, working herself to exhaustion trying to get the wheat planted after her father died. I was just passing through, figured I would keep on riding, but something made me stop. He came and helped me without saying a single word," Sarah continued, taking up the story. "Just took the plow from my hands and started working like it was the most natural thing in the world." "Why did you not say anything?" Daniel asked. He had heard this part before, but always seemed fascinated by it. "Because I had learned that words could be dangerous," James said honestly. He had never hidden his past from his children, believing they deserved to know the truth. "I was running from false accusations, and I thought if I stayed silent, I could help your mother and then disappear without causing trouble." "But he could not stay away," Sarah said, her eyes soft as she looked at her husband. "He kept coming back day after day, helping me save the farm. And I fell in love with him, even though I did not know his name or hear his voice for days." "What changed?" Emma asked. "What made you finally talk?" "Your mother's stubborn refusal to give up on me," James said. "When trouble came and I was arrested, she fought for me. She believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. She showed me that running was not the answer, that some things were worth standing and fighting for." The drought eventually broke, the rains returned, and the farm recovered. Daniel brought home a wife when he was 23, a sweet-natured woman named Catherine who fit seamlessly into the family. Emma fell in love with a schoolteacher from Red Willow, a gentle man named Thomas who respected her intelligence and independence. The homestead expanded again, with a second house built for Daniel and Catherine, and plans for a third when Emma and Thomas married. The farm that Sarah's father had started, that Sarah and James had saved and built together, was becoming a family compound, multiple generations working the land side by side. James and Sarah grew older gracefully, their hair turning gray, their movements slower but no less certain. They still worked the farm, though they left more of the heavy labor to their children and, eventually, their grandchildren. The love between them remained as strong as ever, deepened by decades of shared work and joy and sorrow. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. There were grandchildren now, 7 of them ranging from infant to teenager, running and playing around the homestead with boundless energy. There was food and music and dancing, the kind of wholehearted celebration that the frontier bred in people who knew how to appreciate good times because they had survived so many hard ones. As evening fell and the festivities continued, James led Sarah away from the crowd, up to the hill where they had stood so many times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and below them the farm sprawled in all its hard-won prosperity. 30 years, Sarah said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I looked up and saw you standing beside me in that rain-soaked field. Other times it feels like we have always been together. I know exactly what you mean, James said. He pulled her close and they swayed gently together, dancing to music only they could hear. If someone had told me back then, when I was running and hiding and sure my life was over, that I would end up here with you and all of this, I never would have believed them. I almost gave up that day, Sarah admitted. I was so tired, so sure I was going to fail. If you had not come, if you had not helped me, I do not know what would have happened. But I did come, James said firmly, and you did not give up. You never gave up, not on the farm, not on me, not on us. That is your gift, Sarah, that incredible, stubborn strength that will not bend even when it probably should. Sarah laughed softly. You are one to talk about stubborn strength. You survived things that would have broken most men. We saved each other, James said simply. That is what it comes down to. I needed saving as much as you did, we just needed it in different ways. They stood together on the hill as the stars began to appear, holding each other and watching the life they had built continue below them. The sound of children's laughter and music drifted up to them, and Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This was what they had fought for, this moment and all the moments that had led to it. I love you, she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, James replied, kissing her softly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Hartley. You took a broken, running man and gave him a home and a purpose and a family. You gave me everything. Years later, when both James and Sarah were old and gray, when their children who had children, they still made the walk up to that hill on warm summer evenings. Their steps were slower, their bodies worn by decades of hard work, but their spirits remained strong. They would stand together, hands clasped, looking out over the farm that had grown beyond anything Sarah's father could have imagined. The town of Red Willow had grown too, from a rough frontier settlement to a proper community with schools and churches and even a small hospital. The Hartley farm was known throughout the region, respected for the quality of its crops and the character of the family who ran it. Daniel had taken over most of the daily operations, with his own sons learning the work. Emma and Thomas had moved to town so he could run the school, but they visited often, bringing their children to stay for weeks at a time during summer. On a warm July evening in 1908, 30 years after that fateful rainy day when everything changed, James and Sarah made their way up the hill one last time. James had been feeling poorly for weeks, his heart not as strong as it once was. Sarah knew, with the instinct born of decades together, that their time was growing short. But she did not speak of it, did not burden him with her fears. Instead, she simply held his hand and walked slowly beside him, supporting him when he stumbled, lending him her strength as he had so often lent her his. At the top of the hill, they stood together in their favorite spot, looking out over the farm as the sun began to set. The fields were green and lush, the crops promising a good harvest. Cattle grazed in the pastures they had cleared and fenced years ago. The houses, multiple now, glowed with warm lamplight as families settled in for the evening. It is beautiful, James said, his voice weak but filled with satisfaction. Everything we hoped for and more. We did good, did we not? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "We did very good," James agreed. He turned to look at her, and even now, at the end of their story, his eyes held that same warmth and love they had carried for 3 decades. "I need you to know something, Sarah. Every day with you has been a gift. Every morning I woke up beside you, every meal we shared, every challenge we faced together, all of it was worth everything that came before. You made my life worth living." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "And you made mine complete. You were the missing piece I did not know I needed. That day you walked into my field, that was the day my real life began." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant golds and reds. James leaned heavily on Sarah, and she supported him, just as she always had. They did not speak again, did not need to. Everything that mattered had been said in 1,000 different ways over the course of 30 years. When Daniel found them later that evening, they were sitting together at the base of a tree, James's head resting on Sarah's shoulder, her hand clasped in his. He had passed peacefully, the doctor would later say, his old heart simply deciding it had beaten long enough. Sarah was still holding him, tears drying on her wrinkled cheeks, but there was peace in her expression too. The funeral was the largest red willow had ever seen. James Hartley had touched many lives in his 3 decades in Nebraska, had helped countless neighbors, had raised good children and been a pillar of the community. People came from miles around to pay their respects to the quiet man who had worked hard, loved deeply, and lived honorably. Sarah survived her husband by 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that the farm and the family would continue to thrive. She remained sharp and active until the very end, still offering advice and telling stories to any grandchild who would listen. Her favorite story, the one she never tired of telling, was about a rainy day in 1878 when a cowboy walked into her field and changed her life without saying a single word. When Sarah finally passed in her sleep one peaceful autumn night in 1913, surrounded by family, she was buried beside James on the hill overlooking the farm, next to her parents. The stone that marked their graves was simple but beautiful, carved with their names and dates, and beneath, a single line chosen by their children. They saved each other. The farm continued for generations, the Hartley name becoming synonymous with hard work, integrity, and love of the land. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren walked the same fields that Sarah had struggled to plow alone in the rain, that James had helped her finish without expectation of reward or thanks. The story of how James and Sarah met became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures or flowery words, but with simple acts of kindness between 2 people who need each other more than they know. And on quiet spring days when rain falls softly on the Nebraska plains, some say you can still feel their presence on that farm, 2 spirits bound together by love and work, and an unwavering faith in each other, watching over the land and the family they built together, satisfied with the legacy they left behind.